Hello and welcome to the AP European History and IB History Year 1 review session titled Intellectual and Cultural Themes. This one's different from the others in that whereas before we've been focusing on a geographic area, Britain or France or the Habsburg realms or Eastern Europe, for this one we're going to try to touch on some intellectual and cultural themes that although situated in one part of Europe, hopefully had a pretty broad geographic impact. And we're going to start with the whole question, the whole debate over secular versus spiritual power, and secular versus spiritual philosophy. Really, the debate was already going underway when in 1302 Pope Boniface VIII issued Unum Sanctum, an essay in which he laid out the supremacy of the spiritual leadership over secular or temporal leadership. And the reason why he did this was because Philippe le Bel, the King of France, Philippe IV, was proposing to tax the church in order to help defray some of his debts. And Boniface was asserting that the church was above being taxed, that there was no secular authority that could tax the church. And in Unum Sanctum, he lays out a metaphor of two swords, the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. And he essentially argues that no secular leader may grasp the spiritual sword, that is spiritual power, the power of the church. And on the other hand, he argues that the temporal sword, the secular power that rulers grasp, princes and emperors and kings grasp, they grasp only in the service of the church and only essentially with the sanction and the permission of the church. And so even in wielding the power that they rightfully wield, they still must do so in the service of the church and with the sanction of the church. And so that was Boniface's case for the supremacy of spiritual power over secular power. Now, he was about to learn a nasty lesson because Philippe then invaded Italy and captured him. Boniface was imprisoned by Philippe's army, and although he escaped, he died shortly thereafter as a result of neglect and abuse that he suffered at the hands of the French. So, on the one hand, he had made a philosophical case for the spiritual authority being supreme, but in practical reality, he found that he was subject to the power of kings. And for a period then of 68 years, the entire papacy became a puppet of the French monarchy, because after Boniface died, the College of Cardinals was essentially reduced down to those who were French, and they elected a pope, Clement V, who was willing to essentially be a puppet of Philippe IV. And he actually moved the papal court to Avignon, which was near France. And as I said, for 68 years, a period known in Christendom as the Babylonian captivity, as a reference to the Jews' captivity in Babylon. So for a period of almost 70 years, the church was essentially under the control of the French monarchy and was a puppet of the French monarchy. And during this period, not only was it a puppet of the monarchy, but this was the period during which you can begin to see a marked increase in the decadence and the worldliness and the obsession with luxury. The papal palace in Avignon alone is a symbol of that. And these things ultimately came to spark the Reformation, and just general dissatisfaction with the church, and finally the Counter-Reformation, which sought to finally clean these things up. Now, the Avignon papacy ended in 1377. Interestingly, the last of the Avignon popes was on pilgrimage in Rome when he unexpectedly died. And according to church tradition, the College of Cardinals must meet where the last pope died in order to select the next pope. And the Romans, the people of Rome, who had really felt the economic impact of losing the papacy, and just the people of Italy in general, who always felt like the Pope ought to be Italian, actually in a mob gathered around where the College of Cardinals was meeting, and they said, "Give us a Roman Pope or we will burn the building down." And so they got a Roman Pope, Urban VI. And Urban VI immediately began to try to clean out the decadence and the luxury that he associated correctly with the Avignon papacy. But he met resistance. There were many bishops, archbishops, cardinals who had grown fond of that decadent lifestyle. And so they, feeling that Urban was now overstepping his boundaries as pope, they seceded and formed a second college of cardinals and elected an alternative pope. And now, for a period of another 30 years, the Western Christendom was divided, and this is what's known as the Western Schism. In the Western Schism, there were those who were loyal to the Avignon Pope, and those who were loyal to Urban and his successors in Rome. And very quickly, Europe divided and took sides, and countries aligned with one pope or another, and the popes declared each other to be the Antichrist, and they excommunicated each other, and their client countries went to war against each other, and it was a real mess. And finally, after the Council of Constance, a compromise pope was elected, and you had one pope again. But the entire process throughout the 14th century and into the 15th century really undermined the authority and the credibility of the Roman Catholic Church in the eyes of many Europeans. And then, of course, along with that, again, this growing obsession with luxury, this growing decadence, was also going to be a contributor to the Reformation which came. Simultaneous with this, then, was the Black Death. The Black Death had made its way into Europe as a result of trade, which had picked up following the Crusades. Two kinds of trade, really. Both trade between Europe and Asia, and then also trade within Europe. Trade had kind of ground to a halt during the medieval period, but now in the early modern period it was revived. And the problem with that was that the boats that were bringing in goods from Asia were carrying in their holds rats who were infested with various plagues. These rats ultimately made their way onto the wharves in Italian port cities like Genoa and Venice. And in 1348, having made their way up onto the wharves, they were bitten by fleas. Most European cities were flea infested at that time, and these fleas took the infected blood, and when they then jumped onto humans and bit them, infected humans. And then it became human to flea to human, and very quickly the plague began to spread. And the Black Death, as you know, killed millions. Some people say it killed as many as a third of the European population. And the impact that this then had on secular versus spiritual authority was that many people attributed the Black Death to the wrath of God. They regarded it as God's punishment on a sinful population. And they turned to the church, but the church couldn't protect them. And indeed, the church couldn't protect their own people. Priests and monks who were caring for the sick were dying off at rates equal to or greater than the general population. And so people began to question whether the church was their true connection to God. They didn't stop believing in God, but they began to wonder whether the church was their true connection to God. And you have some people who sort of go out on their own and try to make a direct appeal to God. These are the flagellants, people who practiced flagellation. They would, go and they would beat themselves with the cat o' nine tails in front of the church in order to attempt to show God that they understood their own sinful nature and that they were punishing themselves, with the idea being that then God would not have to punish them. And, of course, stories came out of great miracles among the flagellants, and whether these stories were true or not, they were given credibility by the public, and it added to that first really round of questioning of the church and its role as the connection to God. People who were making a direct appeal to God seemed to be doing a little better than those who relied on the church. And so by the end of the 14th century, already you were beginning to see that the church was beginning to falter. 2 centuries before that, the church was supreme, having mounted the First Crusade, which united Christians from all across Europe to accomplish this amazing goal of capturing Jerusalem, and now the church was faltering. And another concern, and rightfully so, that some had, was the introduction, or rather the reintroduction, of the intellectual heritage of the Greeks and Romans back into Western Europe. That had essentially disappeared during the medieval era. After the collapse of Roman authority in the West, the only repositories of the intellectual heritage, the knowledge, the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans were in the East. They were in Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, or among the Arabs, who, fascinated by knowledge, had translated it for their own use. And for a long time, there was no connection between Western Europe and Eastern, and so that reintroduction had never happened. Well, again, with the revival of trade, following the Crusades, Western Europeans now began to trade regularly with Asians, and what happened was there was intellectual exchange as well as economic exchange, and that heritage, that legacy of ancient Greece and ancient Rome was now being reintroduced back into Western Europe. Of course, the Greeks and Romans, and the Greeks in particular, had a very different approach to knowledge than the medieval church had. The medieval church had always held that the Bible was the sole source of knowledge and that only one person, the Pope, was really authoritative in telling people what the Bible said. But on the other hand, the Greeks had believed that any person who was willing to question rigorously enough and employ reason, sort of consistently enough, could discover things on their own. And this was really the key to the genius of the ancient Greeks, was their willingness to assume that they didn't have an answer and explore all the possible universe of answers and work their way through that universe through questioning and reasoning to come to discover new truth. Well, in the universities, which had been established in the late medieval period by the church in order to spread the doctrines of Roman Catholicism, this different approach to knowledge was intriguing. And that was a concern, because what if that approach to knowledge were to take thinkers down a different road than the church wanted and lead to a challenging of church doctrines? The problem was largely addressed through the philosophy known as Scholasticism. And the most famous exponent of Scholasticism was Thomas Aquinas, who actually lived late in the 13th century. But the concept of Scholasticism is that the approach to knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, the tools of logic and reason and questioning of the Greeks and Romans, was not necessarily inconsistent with church doctrine. As a matter of fact, the scholastics figured that you could use the tools of Aristotle to actually affirm church doctrine and reinforce it. Now, what this meant was that they were using the tools, but they were using them in a different way. The scholastics had an endpoint in mind, and then they employed the tools of the Greeks to essentially fight toward that endpoint. Now, the Greeks would have never, the Greeks didn't use their approach to knowledge this way, their knowledge tools this way. They approached without an endpoint in mind, and they were seeking truth. The scholastics presumed that they knew truth. Truth was traditional church doctrine, but they could use the tools to demonstrate that it was true in another way. The one thing that this did do, however, was it prevented the church from being so threatened by the introduction of the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans and the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans and their way of thinking, that they did not attempt to suppress it. And instead they allowed that to sort of flourish, and it opened the door then for the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is the rebirth in Western Europe of the knowledge and the heritage and the legacy of the Greeks and Romans, their intellectual heritage, their culture. And that wouldn't have been possible had the scholastics not at least shown that it wasn't necessarily a threat to the church. And that then gave birth then to the philosophy of humanism, which is the philosophy we usually associate with the Renaissance. Humanism was different because it not only took questioning and reason as the basis of knowledge, but it went beyond that. It celebrated the human pursuit of knowledge. It celebrated the human pursuit of perfection. The medieval church had taught that really the only purpose of life was to prepare for death, to do the things that you needed to do and complete the tasks that the church said you needed to complete in order to earn eternal life after death. And the humanists sort of rejected that because the Greeks had rejected that. Don't get me wrong, the Greeks had obsessed for a time on sort of pleasing the gods. But over time, the Greeks realized that the temples that they built to honor the gods, the athletic endeavors that they entered into in order to honor the gods, the theater competitions that they entered into in order to honor the gods, also had worth in and of themselves. They were admirable. The accomplishments of those architects and those builders and those athletes and those playwrights and those poets, those accomplishments were honorable in and of themselves, entirely separate from their function as being honoring the gods. And the Greeks and then the humanists embraced the idea that human life is about more than just preparing for death, and it's about more than just honoring the gods, but that rather human life has a worth and a value and a dignity all its own, and that the accomplishments, the achievements that we can undertake in this life are therefore worthy of celebration. It's not that life is more than just preparing for death. Now, these people did not throw God out the window. They didn't even throw the church out the window. They simply believed that honoring God was important and being a part of the church was important, but that also your secular accomplishments were also important. So note that some of the most famous humanists, persons who were influenced by humanism, artists like Michelangelo Buonarroti and Leonardo da Vinci, these guys, they continued to paint and sculpt religious subjects with great love and great piety. It's just that they're going to increasingly emphasize the humanness of those subjects and not only their spiritual significance. So, for example, if you look at works of medieval era painting and compare them with works of humanist-inspired or humanist-influenced Renaissance painting, they'll be so different from each other. For one thing, in the medieval era, although I will say this, they'll be different in terms of their technique, not necessarily their subject. As I said, they're going to continue to paint and sculpt the Madonna, the Pietà, the David, Christ. Those will continue to be the subjects. It's the technique that's going to be different. So, for example, in the medieval era, in a composition, the most spiritually significant figure in the composition would always be outsized, completely out of all human proportion to all of the other figures in the composition. Super big, a giant. And also in medieval painting, because of the interpretation of the second commandment at that time, which said that it was sinful to portray something in heaven, the settings of those paintings would always be sort of ambiguous. There would be no setting to speak of, because on the one hand it was inappropriate to put a spiritually significant figure in an earthly setting, but on the other hand you couldn't put them in a heavenly setting, so there'd be essentially no setting at all. A throne or a group of angels or a group of saints would provide the background, the setting of the composition. Additionally, because the medieval artist was focused on the spiritual side of their subjects and not the human side, there was really no effort made at creating a realistic representation of the human body. They didn't mix pigments very much to try to create the skin tones and tones of fabric and clothing. They didn't use the technique of light and shadow to create the illusion of three dimensions, or the technique of really perspective in their settings to create the illusion of three dimensions. Their subjects tend to look flat, two-dimensional, and also they tended not to give them any real facial expressions, because in the facial expression, that's where you see the emotions, and the emotions are an expression of humanity. And they didn't really care to express their subjects' humanity in the medieval era. By contrast, humanist-inspired Renaissance painting, first of all, they are interested in portraying their subjects, Mary, Jesus, David, whomever. They are interested in portraying them as humans, so they don't paint them in some sort of weird, as giants, disproportionate to all the other subjects in their composition. They are willing to place them on earth in earthly settings, because if you're trying to emphasize the humanity of the subject, then earth is the appropriate place to put them. They therefore made an effort to develop realistic settings, and attempted to represent life on earth as realistically as possible. So, for example, they mixed pigments to try to replicate skin tones and the tones of the fabric of people's clothing. They perfected the technique of light and shadow to create the illusion of three dimensions and facial features and things like that. They gave their subjects facial expressions, real ones, to convey real emotions, to emphasize the humanness, the humanity of these significantly, spiritually significant people. Whereas in medieval era paintings, they would have these big gold halos, those get de-emphasized in humanist-inspired Renaissance paintings. So you get the idea, and also, since they were developing earthly settings, they tried to present those as realistically as possible, and that then gave rise to the use of perspective. Perspective had been a project that many artists had been working on, but this technique for creating the illusion of three dimensions in a two-dimensional space was really popularized by Filippo Brunelleschi. Filippo Brunelleschi had designed and supervised the construction of the dome of the Duomo of Florence, but he also used the technique of perspective that he was in the process of perfecting to paint an image of the baptistry of Florence. And he bored a hole through the canvas, and he set up his easel with the image of the baptistry facing the baptistry, and on the other hand invited people to look through the rear, through the hole, through the rear of the painting at the baptistry, and then while they were looking, he would raise up a mirror so that the image of the actual baptistry was replaced with a mirror showing the painting, and it demonstrated how, through the use of perspective, he had been able to replicate reality so closely, and that helped to popularize perspective. Other humanist artists then employed perspective. So, for example, in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, again, an important spiritual moment featuring extremely important spiritual figures, he uses perspective. First of all, he sets Christ and his apostles in an earthly setting around the supper table, which is, of course, in the Gospels, a historically real event that happened on earth. Okay, so let's place them on earth. Let's choose that as the setting for Christ with his apostles, rather than Christ on a golden throne surrounded by apostles. Okay, we're going to place them on earth, and to create the illusion of three dimensions in the upper room where that took place, Leonardo employed perspective, and he used the vanishing point where all the lines in perspective, the perspective lines meet. The vanishing point he places right above and behind Christ's head, and that means that all the lines in the room direct you toward Christ. And in that way brings further attention to Christ as the most spiritually significant figure in the composition. Christ, however, is presented in proper proportion to the other apostles. He's not presented as a giant. Another thing that Da Vinci does in the Last Supper is he chooses the moment when Christ tells the apostles that one of them is going to betray him. And that's intentional, because what you get then is you get the apostles' response. They recoil in shock. You get hand gestures, you get facial expressions, and that's exactly what the humanist artist wants. He wants to show these very important spiritual figures at their most human. Similarly, Michelangelo Buonarroti, in his sculpture of the David, he is not the first person to sculpt or paint David. David is a common motif among artists, a common subject. But typically David was presented as this sort of stable figure, having already defeated Goliath, sort of, in David in glory, David triumphant. Not very exciting, and usually pretty flat. But on the other hand, Michelangelo chose to sculpt David at the moment when David is about to face Goliath, or he is facing him, he's about to combat him. And so what you get in the facial expression of David is you get a mixture of sort of fear and determination through his eyes. His muscles are tense. It's a moment of physical as well as emotional tension, so his muscles are tense, which means they're all kind of bulged out. Of course, Michelangelo loved to paint and sculpt people nude because he was inspired by the Greeks, who had this love for the physical form of the human body at its best, right? And so, again, this is another influence of humanism, presenting the human body, presenting David as human. And so he does the same thing, by the way, with the Pieta, which is his sculpture. He has multiple Pietas, but his first Pieta, the Pieta of St. Peter's in Rome, where he has Mary cradling the body of Christ. And Michelangelo went to extreme pains to with great detail, portray the human body, tendons and joints and everything, because he was a humanist, and that was the influential philosophy of the Renaissance era. Now, of course, all of this is happening at the beginning of the early modern era. It's a period in which, as a result of trade, a whole new class of people were emerging, this middle class, merchants, bankers, guild masters, and they were concentrated mostly in the cities. And they constituted a whole new source of patronage for artists. Prior to this time, usually it was only the church, and now this wealthy class of people became another source of income and commissions for this group of artists who were emerging during the Renaissance. And so in big Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Florence, they were the chief patron of the arts, along with the church. Of course, in Rome, the church was a major patron of the arts. And as the modern era dawned, that phenomenon of the growth of towns and cities was spreading throughout Western Europe. It was not only happening in Italy, but also in France, and in the Low Countries, and in Germany, and in Great Britain. And in all of these towns and cities that were largely based on commerce, their growth was largely based on commerce, you had that class of merchants and bankers and guild masters. And not only did they want these fine works of art for themselves, but they wanted these fine works of art for their cities, because whereas the medieval cathedral, or whereas the Gothic cathedral was the draw for the cities in the medieval era, a core of talented artists producing magnificent works was going to be the new draw for the early modern era. And so whether they were councils of signori in Italy, or stadtholders in the Netherlands, or whatever, whomever the leaders of the cities were, and the middle-class leaders, they were interested in attracting talented artists, or, better yet, taking talented artists that were homegrown and cultivating their talents. And so that impulse then gave birth to the expansion of the Renaissance outside of Italy into the rest of Europe, the so-called Northern Renaissance. And what you had was, in these towns and cities that aspired to be cultural centers, the city fathers would take the talented artists, young, and send them to Italy. And there they would apprentice with and learn from the Italian masters. And there they learned the techniques of the Italian Renaissance. Took them back to Belgium, or Flanders. Took them back to the Netherlands. Took them back to Germany and employed them. And what you find is that they embraced the same spiritual themes. So you'll get Albrecht Dürer in Germany, and Peter Bruegel in Flanders, and Hans Holbein in the Netherlands. These guys are going to paint religious subjects as well, employing the techniques that they learned from their Italian masters. But then, interestingly, whereas the Italians then, when they weren't painting religious subjects, they usually embraced classical subjects, a tribute to the era of the Greek and Romans that had inspired them. Very famously, Raphael, when decorating the papal apartments of Julius II, created the School of Athens, this celebration of the great minds of the ancient Greek world, in which he took figures of his era, like Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and portrayed them, painted them as figures of the Greek era, making an explicit connection between Italy of the modern era and the ancient Greeks and Romans. Well, the interest in doing that was not as strong in places like Flanders and the Netherlands. And so what's interesting is the northern Italian Renaissance painters, they paint religious subjects, but when they don't, they paint local subjects. And so you have, in particular, like Albrecht Dürer, he was interested in painting the natural environment in Germany. Maybe Hans Holbein was famous for painting portraits of wealthy persons. Peter Bruegel maybe takes it the farthest. Peter Bruegel was famous for painting scenes from peasant life, peasants returning from a hunt on a winter's day, a peasant wedding, a street fair or street carnival. And so what's interesting is the painters of the Northern Renaissance give us a window into everyday life in their local areas, more so than the painters of the Italian Renaissance did. The painters of the Italian Renaissance, they shift toward classical themes, but in the Northern Renaissance, they shift toward local themes. So Dürer, Hans Holbein, Peter Bruegel, they actually provide us this window into their worlds through their paintings. So as the Renaissance then sort of occupies that period of the 15th century. And it's a period in which the church actually continued its descent, if you want to call it that, its descent into worldliness, its descent into decadence, its descent into luxury. And that means that by the beginning of the 16th century, some of the doubts that people were having at the beginning of the 1400s had just become more pronounced. And indeed, at the end of the 15th century, in 1492, Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI, who was known as the Borgia Pope, he ascends to the throne. And by the time he reached that level, the papacy had become entirely embroiled in secular politics. Famously, Pope Sixtus IV, who was the Della Rovere Pope of the Della Rovere family, rival of the Medicis, he had actually engaged in a conspiracy to try to murder Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici, along with the Pazzi family. And although his particular role in that conspiracy was not well known at the time, the fact that he then tried to impose punishments on Lorenzo de' Medici and on Florence when they punished the Pazzi was a sign that he was getting down into the muck. And indeed, it drew the criticism of many who felt that he was using his spiritual authority to try to advance his secular political goals. In many ways, the Pope, it seemed, had just become one of many secular leaders. And then comes Alexander IV, Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, who took the worldliness and decadence of the papal court and the Vatican and just multiplied it, and then added into it a depravity that became famous. From his affairs, his sexual affairs with his daughter Lucrezia, to the over-the-top orgies that he hosted as the head of the Roman Catholic Church. It really marked a sign that the church was taking a turn for the worse. And people began to take note of this. Most famously, Girolamo Savonarola and Desiderius Erasmus. Savonarola was a monk, if I remember right, is a Dominican monk in Florence, who became extremely critical of the humanist approach to things. As a matter of fact, he regarded the Medicis and their patronage of the arts inspired by humanism as essentially targets for God's wrath. And he managed to turn the Florentine public against even the Medicis and inspire them and encourage them to bring all of their portraits and any sort of books that were humanist or anything like that, along with other sinful objects, and burn them in these great bonfires of the vanities. Savonarola then turned his ire against the church itself and the papal court, And during the era of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, there was plenty to blast away at, and Savonarola did. And finally, he was, with the prompting of the Pope, he was rounded up by the Florentine authorities and executed. Alexander VI's successor, Pope Julius II, did not bring the same level of depravity, like moral depravity, to the papacy, at least in the sense of the sexual side of things. But some would say that Julius II was also a depraved individual in terms of his acceptance of violence as an instrument of church policy. During the medieval era and the early modern era, the city-states and the contadini, the nobles of Italy, had gradually nibbled away at the papal states. And Pope Julius II was determined to make war and regain that territory for the church. He was also a big spender. He had initiated the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica and had hired Bramante, the great Renaissance architect, to design a magnificent church. It'll be the most over-the-top church in Christendom. So Julius II was a big spender. He, as you know, was a major patron of Michelangelo and Raphael, other artists. He was a big spender, but then he was also waging war on behalf of the church. He made alliances, hired mercenary armies, personally led them in battle, and bloodied his sword. He was known as the warrior pope, and the church took criticism for that as well. Particularly from the aforementioned Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was a humanist writer who, as the son of a priest, had first-hand knowledge of the way that the corruption of the church, which seemed to originate at the upper levels of the hierarchy, was now permeating down to the lower levels. And indeed, it was something that was observed throughout Europe, that priests and monks and nuns were now showing signs of moral degradation, drunkenness, prostitution, the whole gauntlet of bad stuff that we don't expect from our spiritual leaders. And so Erasmus, in really two works, blasted away at the church. First of all, in praise of folly, he pointed out all of the inconsistencies between the teachings of Christianity and the secular ways of the church's leadership during this era. And, of course, the church always, whenever it was criticized, would dismiss those criticisms as folly or error. And so Erasmus writes in praise of folly. And then finally, in a little work targeting Julius II directly, called Julius Exclusus, he creates this little dialogue between Pope Julius II and St. Peter. When Julius II the premises Julius II has died, he's approaching heaven's gates. St. Peter's not going to let him in. Why not? Because Pope Julius II has been more interested in the secular business of being pope, raising up armies, hiring mercenaries, and waging war for the secular benefit of the papacy than in his spiritual responsibilities. So there were critics who were already taking note of the church's problems. And the thing is that a lot of these criticisms were now being shared throughout Europe as a result of Johann Gutenberg's printing press. Printing was not a completely new concept. Woodblock printing and stone lithographs had been around for centuries. But neither of those was a very efficient approach to printing. You had to carve an entire page of text, and you had to get it right. And whereas wood, the plates would wear out very quickly after being pressed several times, stone was very expensive. So there was no really efficient way to reproduce printed works. Gutenberg's idea to create out of metal individual type, individual letters, and then create a sort of a wooden frame that you could slide the letters you needed into, that is movable type, that revolutionized the communication. And now all of Europe became sort of, at least wherever the printing press permeated, and it sort of starts in Germany and works its way westward and somewhat southward. Wherever the printing press permeated, all of Europe had become this sort of common, had this sort of common way of sharing ideas. So now the individual criticisms of persons who are unhappy with the church became available sort of to an entire continent to ruminate on and get angry about. And so by the turn of the 16th century, as we go into the 1500s, there's already a growing dissatisfaction with the church. And in particular, the church sale of indulgences. Martin Luther did not invent dissatisfaction with indulgences. The church had found many ways to try to raise money. They required the believers to pay the tithe, which was 10% of their income. They had what was known as Peter's pence, which was a small yearly tax that was nevertheless hated because everybody knew that it went to support the luxurious lifestyles of the Pope and his court. And indulgences increasingly were regarded as another way for the church to extract money from its believers. It started out innocently enough. Indulgences were originally granted by the Pope for free to people who had done some great service to the church. And so, for example, guys who went on crusade could receive an indulgence, or if you came on a pilgrimage, you could receive an indulgence. But in the early modern era, many popes reasoned the greatest service you could do for the church is give them money. And so when people made large contributions to the church, they received an indulgence. And gradually this practice grew into the systematic sale of indulgences, where indulgence mongers were sent throughout Europe with price lists, essentially, and they were to tell the people of Europe that certain sins committed on earth would earn them a certain number of years in purgatory after death to purge their souls of the taint of sin. Don't get me wrong, those sins are forgiven because of your belief in Christ as your Savior, and you're going to go to heaven, but you can't be admitted to heaven with a soul tainted by sin, so that those taints, those stains have to be purged away, and that's what purgatory is for. So these indulgence mongers were sent out to sell people indulgences, and initially they were sold to remove their sins, and then when that market dried up, it was said that you could purchase indulgences to remove the sins of persons who had already died and who were now writhing in purgatory, but that the minute you purchased an indulgence, their souls would spring out of purgatory and go to heaven. And finally, in 1517, Pope Leo X, who inherited Pope Julius II's ambitions, particularly his building ambitions, that is the construction of the new St. Peter's, in an effort to raise money to complete that construction, issued what was known as his Jubilee Bargain, in which another round of indulgence mongers were sent out, and they actually encouraged people to purchase indulgences to cover sins that they planned on committing in the future. So there were all sorts of criticisms of indulgences, one of which was that it tended to increase sinful behavior, because people believed that there would be no consequence for their sinful behavior. They could simply buy it off. Additionally, many of the indulgence sellers got involved in immoral practices, trading indulgences for acts of prostitution, trading indulgences for a beer or beers, things like that. And in Germany in particular, the indulgences were hated because the Germans had come to regard the church as this sort of giant parasite that preyed upon them and sought to extract wealth from them and then sort of export that wealth off to Italy, where it supported the outlandish lifestyles of the Italian popes and their courts. So already there was a hostility toward the sale of indulgences, particularly in Germany. So when Johann Tetzel, a monk who was one of the most successful indulgence salespeople around, when he came into Germany in 1517, not surprisingly, he was met with opposition, most famously from Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was a professor of philosophy, which you should read as theology, at Wittenberg in Saxony, in the northern part of, or in sort of the central part of Germany. And Luther, outraged by the sale of indulgences, posted 95 statements of belief about the sale of indulgences on the church door at Wittenberg. And among these, he stated things like, indulgences are of spiritual value, and therefore They cannot be purchased with something of secular value. You cannot purchase something which is valuable in heaven with something which is valuable only on earth, money. He furthermore complained that the sale of indulgences was not reasonable in light of the fact that that particularly the purchase of indulgences for those who had already died. He argued that even the Pope did not have the power to release the souls of people who had already died from purgatory. He argued that if a person wanted to make his peace with God, he needed to do it himself while he was still alive. And if he didn't, it was too late. And then he argued if the Pope does have the power to do that, why doesn't he empty purgatory out of holy love and sympathy for those who are suffering there, rather than to make money to build a big church? And finally, and most importantly, Martin Luther argued that the sale of indulgences was not justified by Scripture, that it had evolved out of church tradition, but it was not justified by Scripture. The initial reaction of the church to the 95 Theses was fairly slow-moving. Pope Leo X was engaged in other things. Significantly, he was involved in trying to influence the outcome of the election of the next Holy Roman Emperor, who would be Charles V, Charles Habsburg V, who was Leo X's preferred candidate. He's focused on that. Part of the reason why he's not interested in the 95 Theses is that it comes out of Germany. It comes out of Saxony in particular, which was regarded as a sort of a cultural backwater. Nothing important ever comes out of there. And finally, I think it had to do with the fact that the sale of indulgences just wasn't a core doctrine of Roman Catholicism. It was a very helpful practice, but it wasn't a core doctrine. Criticizing the sale of indulgences wasn't a threat to the church. And yet, on the other hand, it's not something they were going to give up either. So it wasn't something worth having a debate over. And so he didn't engage the debate. The problem was, I mentioned the printing press. It's estimated that the 95 Theses were available to every person in Germany within 1 month after him nailing them up to the church door. And very quickly, Germany began to talk about it. And since Luther was being left alone, he began to think more about the doctrines of the church and what other doctrines of the church were not justified by Scripture. And he rolled out, over the next couple of years, several new criticisms of the church, significantly criticisms or rejections of church doctrines. So, for example, he argued that salvation did not require the performance of the sacraments, that the performance of the sacraments, which was, according to church doctrine, required for salvation, was false, not justified by Scripture. Now, he argued that baptism and communion were two sacraments justified by Scripture. You could point out the exact place in the gospel where Jesus told people to do this, but he said the other ones, marriage and reconciliation and last rites and things like that, anointing of the sick, these were good things that God liked, but not required by salvation. They were not required for salvation, and he pointed out that they were not there in the Scripture. They had become part of the sacrament, again, through church practice. But Luther argued church practice was not a sufficient justification for saying that something was required for salvation. He also argued for what he was known as the priesthood of all believers. The Roman Catholic Church held that in order for a person to seek reconciliation with God, he had to go through a priest. The priest had to act as a sort of a mediator between the sinner and God, and take the message to God on the sinner's behalf and receive the message from God and issue penance. And Luther argued that that wasn't necessary, that each person could have a direct relationship with God, appeal directly to him for forgiveness. This is known as the priesthood of all believers. And then connected to all this is the argument that the Bible is the one and only source of truth about Christian practice. He argued that whereas the Roman Catholic Church embraced tradition and embraced the authority of the Pope and the Pope's councils and held their rulings to be equal to Scripture as a source of spiritual truth, Luther rejected this idea and instead argued that the word of the Bible only was a source of spiritual truth. Now, Leo X was alarmed, and Luther was on his radar, because these doctrines, if they were embraced, really were a threat to the church and to the church's very existence, because it suggested that if there really are only two sacraments, and if you really don't need a priest to conduct a direct relationship with God, then what do you need of priests? What do you need of the church? And if the Bible can be your sole source of spiritual truth, what do you need of a pope? And what do you need of cardinals? So now, unlike the 95 Theses, which didn't threaten the existence of the church, these new doctrines did. And so Leo X sought to bring Luther to Rome and essentially place him before the Inquisition. But Frederick the Wise, who was the Elector of Saxony, protected Luther and gave Luther shelter at Wartburg Castle, and basically refused to force Luther to go to Rome to face the Inquisition. And under Frederick's protection, Luther lashed out even more aggressively at the church, not simply criticizing their doctrines, but essentially saying that the church had become sinful and corrupt, and essentially had become the devil's church. At one point, he argues that either the church, either the Pope is Satan's excrement or Satan is the Pope's excrement. He did not know which, Luther wrote. But so finally in 1520, Leo X issued a papal bull, a proclamation called Exsurge Domine, Arise, O Lord, in which he commanded Christians throughout Europe to reject Luther, to not read any of his works, to, if they meet him on the street, they weren't even supposed to look at him. So essentially pretend that Martin Luther didn't exist. But then on the other hand, summoning him to Rome to appear in 30 days or face excommunication. Well, of course, Martin Luther did not fear excommunication. He didn't believe in the authority of the church or of the Pope who was making this threat, so he rejected it. And finally, frustrated, Leo X called upon a political authority, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, whom he had helped get elected, and basically said, look, my spiritual authority has not allowed me to sort of apprehend Martin Luther. Now I'm calling upon you, because your authority as Holy Roman Emperor clearly supersedes that of Frederick the Wise. Summon Luther to appear in an imperial diet, which is what he did, the Diet of Worms. So the Diet of Worms held in Worms, an imperial diet, a meeting together of all the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. And this was an authority which Frederick the Wise simply could not ignore. And there, John Eck put Martin Luther on trial and basically piled up all of Luther's works and said, listen, are these your works? Yes, Luther says. Well, recant. He tells Luther he must recant. These are sinful works. This is heresy. And Luther says, I won't recant. And Eck says, well, why not? And Luther says, well, everything I've written is true. And Eck says, well, how do you know that? And Luther said, because it's based on the Scripture. That is his interpretation of Scripture. And that alone was an act of heresy, because in the Roman Catholic Church, only the Pope and his cardinals could interpret Scripture. So Martin Luther was an unrepentant heretic right there in front of everybody. But he declared that he would not recant, says, here I stand, and he turned and walked out. And with the protection of Frederick the Wise's knights, he continued to defy the Pope. And he went off and he with, again, the ongoing protection of Frederick the Wise, he translated the Bible into German, and over time, an entire Lutheran approach to Christian practice evolved out of this, in which the worship services were held in the vernacular, in the local language, the local dialect, German in Germany, in which the leader of the services was not a priest, not a go-between, but rather a pastor, someone who tended the flock and someone who helped people along in their relationship with God, and that sort of thing, in which there were only two sacraments, baptism and communion. So that Lutheran faith grew out of Luther's protest. But other denominations of Christianity grew out of the Protestant movement as well. In the 1530s, John Calvin, a French dissenter who ends up establishing a community in Geneva in Switzerland, John Calvin established this community based upon his own Protestant belief. Like Martin Luther, Calvin believed that the Roman Catholic Church had become corrupt, and like Martin Luther, he believed that the chief cause of that corruption was worldliness, decadence, impulse for luxury. But Calvin additionally believed in predetermination, or if you prefer, predestination. He held that God chose in advance all those who were to be saved. And then conversely, God determined in advance all those who were not to be saved but be condemned. So before you are even born, God has determined whether you are going to be saved. And how? How has he determined that? Well, by looking forward into your life, because God is omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent. He can look forward and see what your future is, and he can see whether you are going to choose him. And so, having determined whether you are saved, he then goes back and sort of crafts history for all of those people who are going to choose him. And you can get into this, but essentially what it led Calvin to believe is that there were two types of people in the world, the elect and the condemned. And the elect were those whom God had predetermined to be saved. And because God also, to a degree, controls persons' actions, a person who is predetermined to be saved, God will also inspire them to act like a person who is to be saved. So you can tell a person who is of the elect by their actions. How can you do that? Well, they'll act the way God would want them to act. Well, how does God want them to act? Well, just read the Bible, and the Bible will give you many clues as to how God wants his elect to act, particularly the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a lot more specific about certain behaviors than the New Testament is. And so Calvin looked to the Old Testament for inspiration, and if you saw persons who were acting in accordance with the rules laid down in the Old Testament, then you could understand that that is one of God's elect. God chooses them in advance, and they act like it. Now, this is this is like a flip-flop of how many people regard Christianity today. In Christianity, do good things so you can go to heaven, or so God will choose you to go to heaven. Well, in Calvinism, it's the other way around. You're doing good things. That must be a sign that God has chosen you to go to heaven. So doing good things is not how you get to heaven. Doing good things is evidence that you're going to heaven. And what Calvin wanted then were communities made up only of the elect, exclusively of the elect, and that's what Geneva was. In Geneva, Calvin and his followers created laws, and these laws were based on Old Testament law, and these laws were designed not to encourage people to behave in a certain way, but to sort out the elect from those who weren't of the elect. Because Calvin and his folks didn't believe in rehabilitation. You were either chosen by God or you were not. If you were, then you wouldn't break these laws, because these were the laws that defined how God wants people to act, because they're based on the Old Testament. If you're not one of God's chosen, then you will break these laws, and that's how they'll sort out those whom they want in their community, the elect, from those whom they don't want, the condemned. And so these laws are not, again, designed to try to get you to change their behavior. These laws are simply designed to sort. And once you broke these laws, they would banish you from the community. And they didn't have jails. They didn't have really the idea of, hey, you're going to do your time and you're going to come out a changed person. They didn't believe that you could change. Instead, they would banish you from the community. If you kept coming back, eventually they'd kill you. But that was kind of how they worked. And interestingly then, Calvin's Geneva was an extremely orderly community in which people got along well. And whatever you think of the principle of predetermination or the elect or anything else, it made for a very orderly, peaceful community. And many people from throughout Europe heard about this, and they visited, and they sort of said, wow, this is cool, and they would go back to where they came from, and they would take Calvinism and its ideas and its doctrines with them and transplant them. So, for example, that's how the Huguenots came to be starting in the 1530s. Huguenots, who were French Calvinists, going back to where Calvin came from and planting Calvinism there, because Calvin was originally French. That's where Huguenotism came from. The Dutch Reformed Church, established by Guy de Bray, Debray, was a transplant of Calvinism into the Netherlands. Of course, later on caused great problems because the Netherlands were a province of Habsburg Spain, and the Habsburgs wanted to be purely Roman Catholic, and that caused conflict between the Dutch people and their Habsburg overlords. John Knox, K-N-O-X, John Knox in the 1560s transplanted Calvinism from Geneva to Scotland, where it took the form of the Presbyterian Church. And eventually a majority of Scotland's nobles converted to Presbyterianism and removed their Catholic queen, Mary Queen of Scots, from power. In England, dissenting members of the Church of England called Puritans, who were annoyed that the Church of England seemed to be still a little too Roman Catholic, and therefore still too corrupt. They embraced Calvinism and sought to purify the purify the Church of England. So Calvinism spread to many, many countries of Europe. And of course, I mentioned the Church of England, and you know that the Church of England had come into existence as yet another division of Protestant Christianity as a result of Henry VIII's desire to have a male heir, and how that desire led him to seek a divorce or an annulment from his wife Catherine of Aragon. When that was not granted by the Catholic Church, he split from the Catholic Church and took all of England with him, formed the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So by the time you get to, I don't know, let's say the mid-16th century, 1550, about half of the followers of the Roman Catholic Church had departed. They had joined the Lutheran Church, or they had joined one of the many Catholic denominations, or they had become, sort of by administrative fiat, members of the Church of England. So in 1545, the Roman Catholic Church conducted a council, the Council of Trento, or Trent, and this council lasted for 18 years. And in it, the church was essentially trying to get its act together and get up off the mat, or however you want to say it, whatever metaphor you want. But it was the beginning of what became known as the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The Reformation had stripped the church of half of its followers in Western Europe. Now the church was trying to fight back. And they fought back really in three different ways. In some areas, the church actually sort of tacitly acknowledged that Luther had been right about certain things, Luther and the church's other critics. So, for example, at the Council of Trento, they placed strict regulation on the sale of indulgences. At the Council of Trento, they called for a more thorough and effective moral training for priests and monks and nuns. And they also cracked down on the luxurious lifestyles of the church hierarchy. In some other ways, the church drew the line and said, Luther's wrong about these things. Here are things that we believe in, and we're going to continue to believe in them. So among those was the sanctity of all 7 sacraments. The church held that all 7 sacraments were required for salvation. The church further held at Trento that the traditions of the church and the authority of the Pope were equal to the Scripture as authoritative sources for spiritual truth. And then in a third category, the church actually went back on the offensive against Protestantism, not simply defending their own beliefs, but going back on the offensive. So, for example, at the Council of Trento, the church adopted the practice of the Index of Forbidden Books, a list of books and authors that Christians were not allowed to read, members of the church were not allowed to read. They reignited the Inquisition, which had largely been slumbering since the medieval era, and encouraged the vigorous tracking down and prosecution of heretics. They also initiated or approved the establishment of a new order of monks, the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, in 1554. It was founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, and this was an order of monks whose purpose was to travel throughout Europe and then throughout the world, teaching the doctrines, the true doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. And in a lot of ways, through education, it was hoped that they would bring back some of those who had been lost in Europe, but just as importantly, would expand Roman Catholicism in some of the parts of the world which were now being newly opened up, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So by the end of the 16th century, the church had undergone this great cataclysm, this great revolution that Luther had ignited, but had survived and had at Trento gotten its act together and made some changes, and it was pointing itself now in a direction that would allow it to continue to be a viable institution. Maybe not the same powerful institution that it had been back in the medieval era, but a viable institution into the modern era. But the 16th century marked the birth of a new era known as the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason was really going to expand during the 17th and 18th centuries, and in a lot of ways was going to again challenge the church. The Age of Reason really is the merger of two other historical movements, the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Both the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment embrace observation and reason as a pathway toward truth, and particularly systematic observation and systematic observation under controlled circumstances, or what we call an experiment. These combined with the rigorous employment of mathematics and other forms of reasoning could open up doors and could answer questions about the way that the physical world functions and the way that the human world functions. And it was argued could answer those questions better, or at least as good as, probably better than, the spiritual authorities, whom had been relied on for so long. Really, the only difference between the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment is what they were thinking about and where they were directing their questions, because the thinkers of the Scientific Revolution were more focused on the physical world, whereas the thinkers of the Enlightenment were more focused on human society. Starting with the Scientific Revolution and going back into the 16th century, the predominant model for understanding the universe was that of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Aristotle, Greek thinker, Ptolemy, a Greek astronomer who did his observations and writings during the era of Rome. But Aristotle, for example, had written that all objects in the universe were unique, and therefore behaved in unique ways that would not be, that number one, would not be replicated by other objects, and number two, that could not be universalized. That is, there was no such thing as a universal law, Aristotle believed. All objects behaved in their own way and did not behave according to universal laws. He also argued, Aristotle did, that the earth was unmoving. It was rather stationary, stable, at the center of the universe. And Ptolemy had written the same. Ptolemy had expanded on that, stating that all things in the heavens basically were floating around on crystal spheres. So the moon, the stars, the sun floated around the earth, revolved around the earth on crystal spheres, while the earth remained stable at the center. It was a geocentric model of the universe, one that placed the earth, geo, at the center. But in 1543, Nicholas Copernicus introduced a theory that suggested that the sun, rather than the earth, might be at the center of this solar system, right? He issued this theory in his work on the revolution of the heavenly orbs, again published in 1543. And based upon his observations, he argued that the sun, rather than the earth, was located at the center of the universe. Or rather, he said it might be located at the center of the universe. He argued that some of the anomalies in astronomical observations, which he and others had made, could be explained if the sun was at the center with everything revolving around it, rather than the earth being at the center with everything revolving around it. He posed it as a sort of a hypothetical, and in doing so managed to avoid the church's ire. But then in 1610, Galileo Galilei published a work called The Starry Messenger. And in The Starry Messenger, Galileo, through his telescope, had observed Venus, for example, going through phases, the way that the moon does. And he noted that Venus then, the best explanation for the phases of Venus was that it was revolving around the sun and being lit by the sun from different angles. He also noted that, for example, Jupiter had moons, so not everything was revolving around the Earth. There were some things revolving around Jupiter. He noted that the sun and the moon, too, were imperfect, and the old model of the universe had essentially argued that that essentially only heaven was perfect. The Earth, it was argued, was imperfect because it was where imperfect people were. So it was appropriate that Earth would be imperfect. The sun and the moon, however, being in heaven, should be perfect. Anyway, Galileo Galilei, through his telescope, argued that they weren't. So this was a different approach. Galileo essentially argued that Copernicus's theory was in fact more than that, but that through observation it was proved that in fact the Earth is not at the center, stationary, but rather the Earth and other things revolve around the sun. Galileo had also sort of pushed the boundaries with his observations of falling objects. He had done a series of experiments which demonstrated that all objects accelerate, in the absence of air resistance anyway, or other friction, all objects accelerate at the same rate as they fall, the rate of 32 feet per second, or 9.8 meters per second squared. And so Galileo had sort of delivered a double blow to the traditional views of the universe. He had demonstrated a universal law that in fact all objects obey, that all objects, he argued, accelerate at the same rate as they fall. So here was a universal law, which Aristotle said was impossible. And he had also sort of undermined the view of the geocentric universe by, through observation, sort of confirming what Copernicus had suggested might be true back in 1543. Now, this ran him afoul of the church, really for two reasons. Number one, with regard to universal laws, it seemed appropriate to the church that Aristotle's view of all objects being unique was on target because in Genesis, God created all things, each of its own kind and each of its own seed. And so Aristotle's view of all objects having their own unique characteristics and not obeying any universal laws, that seemed to coincide with the Bible. The church had also embraced the Aristotelian Ptolemaean geocentric system, which had the earth standing still, because there's a story in the Old Testament where Joshua's armies of Hebrews are defeating their enemies, and if they can just have a few more hours of daylight, then they can fully defeat their enemies. And so Joshua commands the sun to stand still. And it does. Well, if Joshua commands the sun to stand still, it implies that the sun is moving around the earth. So that older view of the solar system, the geocentric view of the universe, seemed to fit what the Bible said as well. And now Galileo was sort of shooting down both of those theories. He was brought before the Inquisition and made to recant. Galileo is not the hero that Martin Luther is. He did, in fact, recant. But the reality is that by this time, and of course there's this famous story about how, having recanted, when Galileo left, he says, "Eppur si muove," and yet it does move, meaning the earth. Whatever, probably apocryphal, because they would have chopped his head off probably if he'd really said that. He ends up spending the rest of his life under house arrest. It doesn't matter. Because of the printing press, all of these ideas were now, again, had entered into that shared community of knowledge that the printing press made possible, and now people could test these ideas out for themselves. And whether the church was prepared to embrace them or not, they were becoming enshrined as an evolving truth about the way the universe works. And to the extent that the church rejected them and insisted that they weren't true, it just further undermined the church authority. By the way, the church placed both Copernicus and Galileo's works on the Index of Forbidden Books. Now, the thing was that, as I said, the whole process was now underway, and it was picked up then by Johann Kepler, who said, okay, if we assume that the sun is at the center and everything is revolving around it, then all of my observations and calculations make sense. Johann Kepler had picked up on the observations of Tycho Brahe, and Brahe's observations were just comprehensive. And everything, all of Kepler's calculations said that, first of all, Galileo was right. Everything was revolving around the sun. But then, additionally, Kepler noted that they were revolving around the sun in an elliptical orbit, not a circular one, which is what Copernicus and Galileo had initially proposed. Kepler also noted that those orbits were speeding up the closer they got to the sun, slowing down the farther out. So Kepler proposed that there must be some sort of force that was operating, that was sort of emanated by the sun, which propelled these objects in orbit, and so they moved faster when near the sun, slowed down when farther out. He didn't really know what that force was or have a name for it, but then his work was picked up by Sir Isaac Newton, who named it gravity, and basically said that the force of attraction, there's a universal force of attraction of all objects by all objects, that every object in the universe is attracted to every other object in the universe by gravity. And he noted that the force of attraction was a function of the mass of the objects and an inverse function of the distance between them. And he essentially said that the force which pulls the planets into orbit around the sun is the same as the one which pulls the moon in orbit around the earth, and which pulls apples to fall down from trees, and which holds us onto the earth and keeps us from flying off into space. And it was sort of the ultimate universal law, a law which helped to explain the functioning, it seemed, of the entire universe. And so this whole process established observation, again, systematic observation, and when possible, systematic observation under controlled circumstances, followed by the use of mathematical and other types of reasoning to produce truth. And what was happening was the spiritual worldview, which held that all of the answers to our questions could and should be answered by reference to spiritual authorities who would refer to the Bible, was not the only worldview that was effective and a way of getting at truth, but rather it was seen that you're seeing the birth of the scientific worldview that said that individuals could get answers for themselves through observation and the application of reason. And for better or worse, that scientific worldview has become the dominant worldview in the modern era. And especially with the advent of more advanced mathematics, because, for example, you have René Descartes, who showed how all things in nature could be quantified and expressed mathematically, and that was a whole new tool to add to the toolbox of this group of thinkers. That mathematical reasoning, other forms of reasoning, could unlock the secrets of the universe. And that had an unusual effect on thinkers in Europe, because prior to this time, clearly the church had staked its claim to be the sole source of truth. And now the scientific community, the community of thinkers of the scientific revolution, they were showing that the church had been wrong about things, or at least based upon a scientific view, the church had been wrong about things. And so it was another moment where people sort of had to choose. Do you want to embrace the old way of thinking or the new way of thinking? And just like with scholasticism, bridging the gap between church doctrine and the new reintroduction of ancient Greek thought, you have a group of people who try to bridge the gap here as well, and these are known as deists. Deists are people who essentially believe in God. They believe that God exists, and they believe that God created the universe and everything in it, and arguably all of the rules that govern it. But they then argue that God, having made that creation, sets it in motion, and then sort of sits back and becomes a dispassionate observer. In a lot of ways, the deists were scientific revolution or age of reason thinkers who are recreating God in their own image, because that's essentially what the scientist does. Sets up the experiment and watches it run and observes dispassionately. And that's how they envision God, the deists. He does not, they argue, to intervene. He doesn't step in and save you. There are no such thing as miracles where God sort of suspends the rules. God creates the universe, he creates the rules that govern it, and he sets it in motion, and he lets it run. He does not interfere, he does not intervene. That's deism. And some of the famous deists were people like Thomas Paine and Voltaire, whose name was really François-Marie Arouet, but he went by the pen name Voltaire. These are figures of the 18th century, and they really, both of them, blasted away at organized religion, because they believed that organized religion created institutions whose chief interest was to continue in existence and even grow stronger. And they argued that in their efforts to do so, they had gotten farther and farther away from the truth. So deists oftentimes were critical of institutions of organized religion. And as I say, Paine and Voltaire are like that. But they both believe in God. They both believe in God as the creator. Most deists also believed that through reason, one could start to come to an understanding of the universe that was like God's understanding of the universe. The symbol of the pyramid with the eye at the top is a deist symbol. It represents the fact that on Earth we have our own viewpoint that we're stuck in, and therefore we don't really understand how the universe works. That's us at the base of the pyramid, 4 different views of things. But as the pyramid approaches its top, those views merge into one, and there we see the eye of God. And so God sees the universe without a viewpoint, and therefore sees all viewpoints, and that's the essence of being this omniscient, this omniscient being. And so the deist argues that through reason, we can work our way up from the bottom toward the top of that pyramid. Maybe we're never quite getting to the top, but we can see the universe more the way God does. But we must use the tools of observation and reason to get there. And once we get there, if we can start to see the universe the way God does and understand the rules that he created for it, then we can build societies based upon those rules. So unlike Calvin's Geneva, which is based upon religious authority, we can build societies based upon the rules that we have gained a knowledge of through observation and reason. And that's what the United States sort of claimed to be, an empire of reason, a new world order based upon enlightened thinking. Now, there was an even more radical view, which was that since the scientific revolution had exposed the ways that the church was wrong, then the church must be wrong about everything. And this was known as rationalism, and I would even say hyper-rationalism. And these rationalists were people who said, okay, the fact that the church got so many of these things wrong, at least in the eyes of the Age of Reason thinkers, the fact that science and a scientific worldview has opened up a new way to truth means that it's time to throw the church out the window. And so rationalists, argued, for example, that God was not a personal being at all. They went further than the deists. There is no such thing as God as a personal being, but rather that God is present in all of nature, that God exists, is inherent in all of nature. And then other rationalists argued that God is not even that God is simply the name that we have given to the rules which govern the universe. God didn't create them, but because we don't have a better explanation for how those rules came into being, we say God created them. But in fact, the universe runs on rules that are sort of came into being on their own. We call that God. And then there were those critics of the church like Denis Diderot, who pointed out that who argued that God was not merely a fiction whom we had created to answer the questions that we couldn't answer, and therefore sort of a benevolent fiction. But Diderot instead argued that God was a malevolent fiction, not a benign fiction, but a malevolent one, whose name had been employed by the wealthy and the powerful, by nobles, by kings, by the church, as a means of suppressing the poor and the the powerless. And so Diderot argued that we must banish God because as a malevolent fiction, he was used as an oppressive force rather than as a liberating force. It was Diderot who wrote that mankind will never be free until the last until the last prince is strangled to death with the entrails of the last priest. So this was the kind of hyper extreme reaction to this shift in worldviews. I don't know that rationalism came to be the dominant worldview of very many people, but it was certainly out there. So the thinkers of the Enlightenment then are interested in employing the tools of observation and reason to explore an understanding of human nature and of human society, and the very nature of knowledge itself, which is called epistemology. And they sort of broke themselves down into two groups. There was, first of all, the group that was really very much influenced by the scientific revolution. These are people who we might call empiricists, people who believed that the quest for truth began with experience, actual experience with the world around you, and that what your mind could take in through the sensory organs was the most reliable foundation for a pursuit of truth. And then on the other hand, you had what were called foundationalists. And foundationalists believed that the senses were flawed and could lead you astray, and that the best place to start for a pursuit of truth is in the mind itself, with ideas in the mind. And so, for example, the empiricists tended to be more influenced by the scientific revolution. They were influenced by the inductive reasoning that was introduced by Francis Bacon back in the late 15th, the late 16th, early 17th century, who showed how through observations of nature, through many observations of nature, patterns could be discerned, and from those patterns, general rules could be established. So this is a classic case of empiricism. And so, for example, in understanding humanity, you have David Hume, who was an English, I guess Scottish is more correct, a Scottish historian and philosopher. So Hume and his crowd were very much of the opinion that if you were looking into human behavior and you wanted to understand what is ethically correct human behavior, you had to look at outcomes. So if you're confronted with a choice, a decision, and you choose a certain path, a certain direction, a certain action, and the result of that action is unhappiness on the people who are impacted by it, then that experience, that observation of their unhappiness, is all the evidence that you need that you made what was the morally wrong choice. And so for him, the ethics of human behavior was guided by experience. On the other hand, foundationalists looked to not to Francis Bacon and his inductive reasoning, but to René Descartes and his approach to deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with what we might call a priori knowledge. That is knowledge that is, for want of a better term, hardwired into your brain from day one. Knowledge that is not based on external experience, but knowledge which is entirely originates in the mind. And though that kind of knowledge takes the form of broad principles, and then when you experience a specific instance, a specific set of circumstances in life, you take these broad principles and you apply them. And so it's sort of the opposite from inductive reasoning. It is closer to the reasoning of Aristotle, and therefore, for many people, a step backward from the Enlightenment. But the difference, I suppose, is that whereas the a priori knowledge or the deductive reasoning which had been going on in the world had started with doctrines of the church for the last 1,000 years or so, with their deductive reasoning focused foundationalist Enlightenment thinkers, they believed that the the big ideas originated not or were not revealed by God, but were hardwired into the nature of humanity. So in the realm of ethics, then, the Prussian Immanuel Kant, he then did not believe that that an ethical decision was revealed by your observations of its impact on the people it affected, but rather an ethical decision was determined by how it lined up with these a priori principles that were wired into your brain, and most significantly, the categorical imperative, which held that behavior is ethical if the person who makes the behavior choice would want to have that choice made universal. If he would want everybody to behave in the same way, then that's an ethical choice. It's a sort of secular version of Christianity's golden rule. If you behave in the manner that you would want everybody to behave, if you treat others in the way that you would expect to be treated, then that's an ethical decision. And it has more to do with intent than with outcomes. And of course, as in any intellectual movement, the two sides critiqued each other. Your foundationalists argued that the senses were imperfect and could be fooled, and so they argued that inductive reasoning from observation was imperfect. And then, of course, the empiricists argued that you had no way of proving the validity of any of this a priori knowledge that was rumbling around in your brain, and so you were really no more you were no different from the church in terms of the way that you reasoned. So they critiqued each other, and so you must understand that the Enlightenment is not monolithic. There are agreements, there are disagreements. One thing that they all agreed on was that questions should not be referred back to spiritual authority, to the church, to religious authority, but rather that individuals should pursue answers to their questions, whether they be questions about the physical world or about human nature and human society. They should attempt to answer those questions themselves. Now, one of the really productive areas of philosophy under the Age of Enlightenment was that of political philosophy. And one of the earliest political philosophers of the Enlightenment was Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes, in his Leviathan, actually made a case for absolute monarchy. He argued that the nature of man was corrupt, that the nature of man was evil, that left to their own devices, men would lie, cheat, steal, and kill to get what they wanted. And as long as there was no strong government in place to sort of keep them in line and force them to treat each other well, human society would devolve into chaos and a condition of constant war of every man against every man, and society would collapse into a condition in which the life of man became solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he argued for absolute monarchy as the only form of government strong enough to force everybody to stay in line and treat each other with decency. So that doesn't sound very enlightened, but what was interesting about it is that he based his argument not on divine right, not on a claim that absolute monarchs must rule because God appointed them to rule, which was the sort of pre-Enlightenment argument, but rather on his observations of human nature and reasoning forward from those observations. So that's sort of what makes Hobbes an enlightened thinker. Although we generally associate the Enlightenment with more democratic forms of government, or more forms of government that are more responsive to the people's needs. So the critic, one of the early critics of Hobbes then was John Locke, who also believed that without some sort of authority to prevent individuals from using their freedom to trample that of others, he began in a lot of ways the same place that Hobbes did. Locke envisioned a state of nature in which every man was totally free, and yet every man was therefore almost not free, because if every man is totally free, then they can do whatever they want, including take your property, deprive you of your life, enslave you. And so Locke too argued that government had to be in place, and it must be empowered through the will of the people, through a choice of the people, to make laws and enforce laws that were designed to ensure that people's natural rights were protected, their right to life, liberty, and property. And he argued that was the full purpose of government in his two treatises of government, and specifically his second treatise of government. But furthermore, he argued, unlike Hobbes, that government needed to be absolute in order to perform that function effectively. He argued that that was quite untrue, that governments which were absolute ended up abusing their own power. And what he argued instead was that once the people had empowered government to protect their natural rights, that power could never be used to destroy those natural rights. And if it did, then the people then had the right to reject that government and destroy it and start over, essentially, because it had become like a Frankenstein's monster, destroying the thing that it was designed to protect. So Locke argued for limits on the powers of government, that when government passed those limits, it was no longer performing the function that it was supposed to perform. Now, both of these guys were really referencing a concept called the social contract. And the idea that government existed, government came into existence for the people's good, and that it therefore, although they owed the government their loyalty and other things like taxes and service and whatever, the government in return owed them a better standard of living, essentially, a better quality of life, better protection of their rights. This phrase, social contract, was created then in 1762 by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in an essay by that name, The Social Contract, gives a name to the concept. And Rousseau also believed, however, that he was sort of an anti-Enlightenment type character. He didn't necessarily believe that reason was the answer for everything. And he believed that, in general, people didn't need to think their way through problems, but that their intuition, what he called the way of the heart, would lead them to the right choices. And he actually, we'll get into this when we talk about Romanticism, but he actually believed that people were better off if they were less inclined to appeal to reason and more inclined to appeal to intuition. And he also then, connecting this to political philosophy, he believed that there was a sort of a general will of the people, and as long as governments were in line with that general will, they didn't really need to do much, and so in the social contract as Rousseau envisioned it, the people owed the government their obedience, but only to the extent that the government reflected the general will. But we'll get back to Rousseau later. The question, though, of how to properly limit the powers of government then was taken up by a Frenchman, the Baron de Montesquieu, in L'Esprit des Lois, the Spirit of the Laws, in which he argued that the best way to ensure that government did not become oppressive, did not overstep its boundaries, did not begin to destroy the natural rights that it was meant to protect, was by taking the powers of government and dividing them into branches, the judicial, the executive, the legislative power, and making sure that those were in the hands of separate people, because he argued that if more than one type of government power, political power, came into the hands of one person, they were most likely to use it in a tyrannical way. So not only did he propose the separation of government powers, but the establishment of checks by which the three branches and those in charge of them could keep the powers in balance, so a system of checks and balances. Now, of course, all of these came to have influence first on the Americans in our revolution and the establishment of our Constitution, and then on the French as well, and later constitutions throughout Europe. Others, like Voltaire, argued that government's function, they picked up on the idea of natural rights and then began to spell those rights out more specifically as sort of areas, realms of a man's life that government ought not, into which government ought not to intrude. And so people like Voltaire argue for freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so on, passionately so. And And on the other hand, you notice I said that these are areas of the lives of men that ought not to be intruded upon by government. Well, many of the Enlightenment thinkers did not really consider the rights of women. Although in many cases the salons, which were these sort of gatherings of persons of wealth, famously in Paris, where they would gather around and sit around and think and talk and discuss and argue and debate, women were oftentimes welcome there. This is where a lot of the thinking of the Enlightenment was happening. And yet, for the most part, the Enlightenment thinkers did not take into account the rights of women. And so you have Mary Wollstonecraft in the second half of the 18th century, who then makes a passionate argument in defense of the rights of women, particularly the right to be educated, because she believed that education was sort of the key, that women had the same intellectual capacities as men, but in denying women education, they were denying women the opportunity to cultivate those capacities and therefore use them at their maximum. And there came to be at this point then, as we work our way through the Enlightenment into the 18th century, particularly in the area of political philosophy, the idea that governments ought to be more responsive to the people and ought to be looking out for the natural rights of the people. Those rights were not owed to the government. Those rights were owed to the nature of being a human, and the government should play its role in protecting those rights. Some monarchs in Europe embraced that idea. Famously, Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph II of Austria, to a lesser extent perhaps Catherine the Great of Russia, they became known as enlightened monarchs or enlightened despots because they allowed for a broader freedom for their people, particularly freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of worship. Frederick the Great of Prussia was famous for promoting those things. And for that, he gained first of all, he was influenced by Voltaire, but he also gained the approval of Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers. Immanuel Kant, the Prussian philosopher, offered up in his reflection on what the Enlightenment had been. He argued that the motto of the Enlightenment is, have the courage to use your own intelligence. The people had relied too long on greater social institutions like the church or the monarchy or the nobility to make their decisions for them, but instead he called upon individuals to have the courage to use their own intelligence. He argued that if a monarch wanted his society to be enlightened, he had to empower them to do so. And taking Frederick the Great as his example, he said, give them these freedoms, the freedoms to make public use of their intelligence, to debate and discuss, and then you'll have an enlightened population. So the Age of Reason produced not just thinkers and philosophers, but it produced a generation of monarchs who actually sought, in some cases, to translate the principles of the Enlightenment into actual political practice to improve the conditions of their subjects. But in general, the spirit of the Enlightenment was this, that questions ought not to be, the spirit of the Age of Reason, questions ought not to be referred to religious, spiritual authorities, but rather should be solved, should be pursued, answers to those questions should be pursued by individuals employing observation and various types of reason, and in general that the human mind, under the benevolent influence of reason, was the greatest force for the pursuit of truth in the universe. And that philosophy became the dominant philosophy until the early 19th century, when it was challenged by the Romantics. And actually, you had already begun to see a little bit of Romanticism appearing even among guys who we would consider to be poster children for the Enlightenment. The Romantics, the spirit of Romanticism is a questioning. It's a questioning of the conclusions of the Age of Reason. If the Age of Reason concluded that the human mind, working under the influence of reason, was the greatest force for the pursuit of truth, the Romantics challenged that and doubted that. They questioned whether the human mind could actually comprehend everything, had that kind of power. They instead presented the universe as being full of mystery, and there were great dark spaces and spaces of doubt. And the Romantics, far from being befuddled by that and disturbed by that, and far from considering, since they believed that the universe was a mystery, from the perspective of the Age of Reason, if there are things we don't understand, then that's a sign of our weakness, that we need to do better in cultivating our minds. But the Romantics, rather than regarding things that we don't know as a sign of weakness, they actually took that as something to be celebrated. Now, as I said, you began to see little rumblings of this even in the Enlightenment. So, for example, John Locke had written back in 1689 in the essay concerning human understanding. He had written about a question of whether the rules of reason, which were being employed so vigorously to challenge all of the old doctrines, he questioned whether the rules of reason were actually inherent in the universe and simply being discovered by humans, or whether humans had invented those rules as a way of making sense of things. Because if human beings had invented those rules, he argued, they too were, just as imperfect as the old doctrines that they were being employed to break down. And so he called upon his fellow Age of Enlightenment thinkers, or Age of Reason thinkers, to examine with the same scrutiny that they were subjecting the old ideas to examine the new ideas to that same kind of scrutiny. Use reason to study reason and figure out whether it was reasonable, figure out whether it was real or a human construction. Immanuel Kant, who I mentioned, in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, had argued that if reason alone were driving human behavior, and if reason alone was essentially the source of the best of human behavior, then a lot of the things that we value about human behavior, compassion, altruism, wouldn't come into existence. He argued that human beings at their best act unreasonably, that selfless behavior, altruistic behavior cannot be chalked up to reason. Reason doesn't lead us down that path, but instead there must be some sort of moral impulse that leads us to, that sort of trumps our reason sometimes, and leads us to do things that are for the good of all. I mentioned Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that the best source of guidance for us in our decision-making was not our mind and employing reason, but our, what he called the way of the heart, our intuition, our gut. And he actually argued that the more a person became educated in the ways of the Enlightenment, more ingrained in the ways of reason, the farther and farther he was getting from the real source of truth, which was his instinct, his heart, his intuition. So these guys, by the beginning of the 19th century, there was already some talk about whether the conclusions of the Age of Reason thinkers were really on target. And so, into the 19th century then, you begin to see a couple of things. Number one, the Industrial Revolution was well underway, and it had produced some pretty grubby and ugly scenes in the cities of Western Europe. And a lot of people felt like all of that was made possible by sort of reasoned thinking going unchecked. Not a lot of compassion, not a lot of aesthetic consideration had gone into the process of industrialization and urbanization. It was all just sort of strictly rational process. And then, of course, also the French Revolution and Napoleon had also at least claimed to have been grounded in reason. And so people looked at that and saw the millions of people killed and their lives ruined. And so it seemed like by 1820 or so, it seemed like the unchecked pursuit of reason had taken Europe some ugly ways. And that's part of the reason why Romanticism picked up steam. And people began to cherish instead the savage lifestyle, the lifestyle that was lived closer to nature, as close to nature as possible. And people began to speak of the noble savage, that the person who lived a life close to nature was living a nobler lifestyle. And that is, in a lot of ways, what Rousseau was talking about. That the more educated you got, the more divorced from what was real and what was noble you got. And Romanticism manifests itself in the visual arts, it manifests itself in literature, it manifests itself in the development of a whole movement in the visual arts of landscape painting, because since nature is now deemed to be superior to human reason, since nature is the source of truth in the eyes of the Romantics, they want to celebrate nature in their work. And so you have, for example, J.M.W. Turner, an Englishman painter, who paint landscapes and seascapes, and he's really into storms, and he's really into waves crashing and winds blowing, and what you see in a lot of the Romantic painters' work is human beings are present there, but they're sort of tiny, and they're outsized by the forces that are swirling around them, the winds and the waves and that kind of thing. And it's meant to remind us that nature is really in charge here, that the forces of nature are greater than humans, and it's supposed to invite the human into the picture and to be in awe of the power of nature. Awe is a very important emotion for the Romantics, the sense of being in the presence of something much more powerful than you. And on the other hand, the Romantic painters, landscape painters, also embraced calmer scenes, but rural scenes. One of the interesting things about the Romantics and their pursuit of the noble savage was the Europeans really became interested in American Indians because they didn't really have the equivalent of that in Europe. The closest thing that is the person who really lives in harmony with nature, right? The closest thing they had left in Europe was farmers. The farmer, as opposed to the industrial worker in the city, lived a life that was more directed by nature. And so farmers and rural living came to be celebrated. And so you have the works, again, the landscapes of John Constable, again, an English landscape painter, who portrayed rural living, scenes of rural living, and romanticized the life of the farmer as being like that of the noble savage. As I mentioned, the Romantic movement also makes its way into literature. And so you have a lot of literature that celebrates nature and celebrates how nature is permanent and powerful and awe-inspiring, whereas what humans create is not. It's sort of impermanent, temporary, artificial. So William Wordsworth is one of the great Romantic poets, writes a work called Tintern Abbey, in which he describes scenes of nature and essentially presents it as a refuge from the hubbub and the sort of craziness of city life. It's a refuge from that. On the other hand, Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, in his famous work To a Mouse, describes a mouse whose house he turns up with his plow, and everything in the mouse's life is suddenly thrown into craziness, and he feels bad, and he essentially apologizes to the mouse, but in the process of doing so, he realizes that as screwed up as the mouse's life is, his is even more screwed up, because he has to deal with all of the demands that human society have begun to impose on him in this increasingly modern industrial era. On the other hand, you have William Blake's work, The Tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? He's writing about a very powerful beast, but it's not the beast who's to be feared. What is to be feared, what is to be awe-inspiring. The beast isn't. The tiger is awe-inspiring, but what's even more awe-inspiring is the creator of the tiger, which he doesn't necessarily, give a name to that creator, but whomever was powerful enough to create something as powerful as a tiger, that's truly awe-inspiring. And so, again, celebrating nature, being in awe of nature, that is the theme of the Romantic era. But also this rejection of reason. John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, the last line, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That's all you know, it's all you need to know. You want to talk about it, you want to reason it out, you're not going to get anywhere that way. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Goethe, so he's a German writer, had retold the story of a German folktale, Faust, wherein Faust makes a deal with the devil because Faust, there's knowledge that Faust wants. He wants to gain heretofore unknown knowledge, or ungrasped knowledge, and he makes a deal with the devil that the devil will reveal this knowledge to him. And what happens to Faust is that the more knowledge he receives, the more questions it provokes in his mind. And no matter how many answers he gets, the more sort of mystified and befuddled and frustrated he becomes, because he comes ultimately to realize that you can't have total knowledge. And that indeed, knowledge just leads you to more questions. And in the end, Faust comes to accept this and accept that the universe truly is a mystery, and a mystery that you can strive restlessly to grasp, but you're better off to come to terms, to come to peace with it. During this period, you also this is a period in which more and more writers come into the influence of opium. Opium, a drug which was introduced primarily as a way for people to deal with pain. People who had things like tuberculosis and gout came to be used recreationally by many artists. Famously, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who explores worlds that are clearly opium-induced, but are mysterious and frightening. And so, for example, in his Rime of the Ancient Mariner, he tells the tale of a guy who is a deckhand on board a ship, and they end up sailing around South America, and the ship ends up in this area of doldrums where the winds don't blow, and so the ship is stuck, and they begin to hallucinate, and from afar a ship approaches, and that's a sign of hope. But when the ship gets close, they find that it's a ship that is entirely crewed by dead men, and it's that kind of thing. This is also the era of Edgar Allan Poe here in the United States. So the Romantic movement starts as a sort of a revolt against the Age of Reason. It's a pushing back against the idea that the human mind can grasp everything if it just uses reason well enough. It's a pushing back against where reason seemed to have taken Europe. And then in the end, it also just gets really, really weird. But it's tied in also, interestingly, Romanticism is tied in also with the growing philosophy of nationalism. So if Romanticism celebrates that which is natural, that which is organic, that which is real, as opposed to that which is artificial and antiseptic and supposedly universal, if that's what Romanticism is about, getting back to what's real, getting back to what's natural and organic, so nationalism associates that with locality. There's a German writer, Johann Gottfried von Herder, who basically establishes the idea that each nation, if a nation is a group of people who are bound together by their cultural heritage and sort of separated out from everybody else by their cultural heritage, if that's a nation, each nation, its culture springs from its physical location, its geography and its geology. Everything where it grows up influences it. The culture is a product of the place, and therefore it is unique to that place and unique to that nation. And he argues that if they want to find happiness, they've got to find it in what's natural and organic and grassroots there, not what somebody else is going to bring in and say, well, this is what I've generated in the confines of my brain, and through reason I've figured out what the best way is for you. But rather, the best source of truth, the best source of perfection, the best source of happiness for a group of people is what they've created organically in their place. This too is a reaction in a lot of ways against Napoleon, because Napoleon, of course, sweeps across Europe, and he brings with him a sort of a universalizing impulse. We're going to make everybody the same. The way that we've created here in France is the best way, and therefore it's best for everybody. Nationalism is in part a reaction against that. Johann Gottfried von Herder is the founder of what's called cultural nationalism. The idea that each nation, each culture will find its best path, its best way forward in what it has created. He establishes a distinction between Kultur and Zivilisation. So Kultur is that which is local, that which has come up organically and is therefore authentic to the place, versus Zivilisation, which is that which sprung out of some guy's head or some group of people's heads. It's established in reason and reason only. It's not grounded in anything that's local and authentic. It's seen as artificial. It's seen as foreign. And so the cultural nationalist prefers Kultur over Zivilisation. Herder never attaches anything political to that. He doesn't say that the German way is best for everybody else. He only says it's best for Germans. He doesn't attempt to foment revolutions out of this. That is the area of political nationalism, and sort of the founder of political nationalism is Giuseppe Mazzini, who argues that nations ought to govern themselves. So if a nation is governed by outsiders, it's ill-governed. And each nation ought to have its own state. Each nation ought to be self-governing. So these monarchs who have built up these empires by taking over other people's territory and governing foreign nations, that's wrong. And Mazzini will found Young Europe, which is an organization dedicated to overthrowing that system. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that the Romantics were sort of rebelling against, or one of the things that prompted them to rebel against the Age of Reason, was the industrial and urban society that was emerging. The industrial economy, the economy of manufacturing, had begun to change European societies, because what was happening was, as the manufacturing process was becoming more sophisticated, as it was being broken down into its constituent parts in what became known as the industrial division of labor, where you take a manufacturing process, break it down to its constituent parts, and you assign one person just to one of those parts, so that that person only has to learn really one skill, and then he masters it through repetition, through extreme repetition. As that became an ingrained system, and as more machines were introduced to help workers with that, and as those machines came to be programmed essentially to do the specific task, and so the job of the worker simply came to be to take the workpiece, place it on the machine, pull the lever or whatever, release it, and then hand the workpiece to the next guy. As that is to say, as the manufacturing process became more and more de-skilled, it became harder and harder for workers to negotiate for better wages, because the more de-skilled the manufacturing process became, the easier it was for anybody to do the work, which meant that the pool of labor was essentially unlimited. And when the pool of labor becomes unlimited in that way, when the supply of labor becomes unlimited, even though the demand for that sort of labor was growing, more and more factories were opening up, even though the demand was growing, the supply was so great that wages were being pressed down to essentially a survival level or even below that level. David Ricardo, an economic philosopher of what was known as the Manchester School, and the Manchester School was not a physical structure, but a group of people who were thinking about economics really for the first time as a academic discipline, had written in his essay on wages. He had written about how the natural cost of producing labor is the cost of keeping a worker alive. It's food and shelter and clothing, and that cost, when labor was scarce and demand for it was high, that cost was more than covered by the wage. But when labor was in plentiful supply and it was far ahead of demand, as it was in the early 19th century, then the wage, the price of labor, would not necessarily cover the cost. And in that case, the life of the worker would become quite wretched and miserable. And he didn't really make a judgment about that. But at the time, most people were of what was known as a liberal perspective, an economically liberal perspective, which held that even though that might be a problem, it was not government's job to attempt to solve that problem. Now, this liberal approach, classically liberal approach to economics, also known as laissez-faire economics, essentially could date back at least to 1776, when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And already people were beginning to wonder how, in a system where families would rely on manufacturers to produce the things they need, whereas before they had produced them on demand themselves, people began to wonder how society would have all of its needs fulfilled. How would manufacturers know what to produce and when to produce it and how much to produce? And already people were saying government ought to step in and dictate the answers to those questions. And Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations argued that that was not necessary, and in fact it would cause problems. But rather that manufacturers, if given the freedom to pursue profit for themselves, they would respond to the needs of society, because only by doing so would they be able to maximize their profits. They would be guided, he said, by an invisible hand or a hidden hand. They wouldn't wake up every day saying, you know what, I'm going to manufacture what society needs today. But this invisible or hidden hand, which was the profit motive, would guide them to do that, because that's the only way they could maximize their profits. And generally speaking, that was the prevailing view. It was the prevailing view of the Manchester School. It was the prevailing view of most political leaders. The first major challenge to that, academic challenge, and political challenge, social challenge, came from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who in 1848 published the Communist Manifesto. And I don't want to say that they were the first to ever challenge the idea. You had socialist movements in England, like the Owenites and so on, Robert Owen and the Owenites, but none of them proposed an explanation for the problem or a solution as radical as that proposed by Marx and Engels, because Marx and Engels basically argued that the problems of wages and of the inequalities in society that the wage problem created essentially were inherent to the capitalist system. In the Communist Manifesto of 1848, and then Marx's monumental work Capital, which is the follow-up and is much more an academic work as opposed to a call to arms. Basically, Marx and Engels argued that the current state of the manufacturing system was just one more stage in the class struggle that had been going on for centuries. In this phase of the class struggle, you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The proletariat, the working class, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the manufacturing interests. And he essentially argued that what was happening in a factory was that the proletariat were working for the wages that were dictated by the laws of supply and demand. But while doing so, they were creating value in the products that they were making. So raw material of value X goes in, and the workers work on it, and when it's all done, finished goods of value X plus come out. And that plus is the added value that the workers, he argues, gave to the product. They created that value, he would argue. Marx and Engels argued that what should happen is that the workers, the proletariat, then would receive that full value that they had created in equal shares, but they noted that in capitalist society that's not what happens. That full value, that additional value, that added value, is when the product is sold, that added value is then kept by the bourgeois factory owner. He does not distribute it out to his workers, all of it in equal shares, but rather he keeps as much as he can and only pays his workers, only distributes as much to his workers as the laws of supply and demand dictate he must. And so you have what's known as the theory of surplus value, which is that, once the workers are distributed their share of the value they created, there's this surplus value, which is then appropriated by the bourgeois factory owner, and it becomes part of his property. And he says, on the other hand, the workers have no property. They don't have possession of anything, and they never will, because the condition of the proletariat is such that, since they are only being paid a survival wage, they can never generate any kind of savings, and therefore they can never own any kind of property. They will never possess any of the means of production themselves. The bourgeoisie as a class will possess the means of production. The proletariat will not possess any. And so the proletariat will always be reliant on the bourgeoisie, which means they always have to accept the terms that the bourgeoisie impose, which is that they're not going to receive the full value that they create. And so Marx refers to the proletariat as wage slaves, that essentially, although technically they can work for any manufacturer they want, their condition is essentially like that of slaves. Slaves maybe on a plantation in the American South before the Civil War. He would argue that, they possess no property of their own, and they are their work. They work from dawn to dusk and produce only enough income to keep themselves in food, shelter, and clothing, and their families. They'll never have savings, therefore never be able to own property, own the means of production themselves. And so, of course, the answer to this for Marx and Engels is a communist revolution. And it must be a revolution of working men of all countries. So the last line of the Communist Manifesto is working men of all countries unite. They must overthrow the government, first of all. He refers to this as winning the battle of democracy. He says you must overthrow the government, and once you've done so, once the working class has seized control of the state, they'll then use the power of the state to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, and then they will operate the factories and the farms in such a way to produce a classless society, a society in which everyone is distributed their share, their equal share of the wealth of society. Marx and Engels, obviously this is their vision. Marx and Engels believed that this revolution was a historical inevitability. It would ultimately have to happen. It would inevitably happen. They believed in the meantime that a lot of the traditional values of capitalist society ought to be utterly rejected by the proletariat. Religion, which they regarded as an opiate, a drug which the working classes were forced to take by the bourgeoisie, that told them that they ought not to look for their reward in this life, but should prepare for a reward in the next life, and so they would not rebel. Property rights and the state were regarded simply as a way of justifying the bourgeoisie keeping what they had and keeping it out of the hands of the proletariat. The state was the instrument for enforcing that. So really a lot of even patriotism they rejected. Why should the working class of France hate the working class of Germany and love the bourgeoisie of France? They argued that the proletariat of France and Germany have interests more in common with each other than with the bourgeoisie of their own country. No, the only good war would therefore be the one in which the working class of all countries would unite to overthrow the bourgeoisie of all countries. Marx and Engels believed that their revolution would ultimately happen. In the meantime, there were some who called themselves, reform or revisionist socialists. And remember, at this time, socialism was essentially a synonym for communism. And they believed, there were others who believed that the goals of equality could be achieved without a violent revolution. Marx and Engels had nothing but disdain for people who believed that. They referred them disdainfully as utopian socialists. Meanwhile, they referred to themselves, the communists, as scientific socialists. That their socialism, which held that a violent revolution was a necessity, was based on reason, a scientific principle, whereas the utopian socialists, thinking that they would get the outcomes of socialism without a socialist revolution, that was sort of pie in the sky. It was utopianism. Of course, Marx and Engels died, and the revolution had never happened. Many Marxists believe that the changes, the reforms that were made in capitalist countries, reforms that protected workers, reforms that improved the conditions of the proletariat in the cities, put off this revolution, and so on. But meanwhile, the cities were producing whole new approaches in the visual arts. You saw cities that were growing up, and they had these monumental structures, railroad stations and exhibition halls, and they had new technologies available to them to construct these huge public spaces. First, iron frame buildings, then steel frame buildings. And with all of this new technology, they still wanted a sense of permanence and place. And so at first what you saw was that they adopted old styles of architecture. So the 19th century is initially a period of classical revival or neoclassicism in architecture, Gothic revival or neo-Gothic architecture. But one of the really first unique artistic trends to come out of the cities was that of the Impressionist painters. Prior to this time, the goal of the painter was to replicate reality as closely as possible, and they did this through painstaking mixing of pigment on the palette to try to produce the exact color of the subject that they were painting. This required that essentially all painting be done in the studio. But the Impressionist painters took advantage of the new paints that were being produced in metal tubes, which they could take out into the world, and they could paint subjects as they saw them in plain air. And many of them chose not to try to replicate reality, but rather to create an impression of reality. And ultimately that gives name to the movement, Impressionism. Not an exact replica like what we would say today would be like a photograph, but rather an impression of an experience with light, an experience with movement. And many of the Impressionists, as they came to be called, experimented with light and movement, representing light and movement in their works. They typically did not mix their pigments to create color, but clustered large, heavy brushstrokes of pigments together to create, again, an impression of color. They attempted, before they were even called the Impressionists, they attempted to gain entry into the prestigious juried show produced by the Academy of Fine Arts. Edward Manet, M-A-N-E-T, who was one of the earliest Impressionists, presented a painting, Luncheon on the Grass, which was then rejected. The followers of Manet were so disappointed that they actually sort of petitioned Napoleon III, and Napoleon III indulged them by conducting what was known as a Salon des Refusés, a gallery for those refused by the juried show promoted by the Academy of Fine Arts. But that was the only such exhibition sponsored by the government. Later on, the followers of Manet created their own show, their own exhibition, which was held in a photographer's studio. And it was actually from that show that they got their name, the Impressionists. There was a work by Claude Monet, M-O-N-E-T, called Impression, Sunrise. And one of the critics said that this work was unfinished, and that was a typical critique. The works of the Impressionists didn't have a finished, polished look to them. They didn't intend that, but this critic said that wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. And he was the one, this critic gave the name Impressionism from the title, Impression, Sunrise, Impressionism, and he meant it as a pejorative. He meant it as an insult. But the painters and the public came to embrace this title. And so Monet was just the beginning with his studies of haystacks, studies of the west facade of the cathedral in Rouen. These were examples of studies of light. The Impressionists loved to paint trains. They loved to paint, because of the motion of trains, they loved to paint scenes from city life, which would have never been considered an acceptable subject for fine art before this time. And so they were revolutionary both in their technique and in the subject that they chose to paint. Later on, they became more radical. Vincent van Gogh, who creates these works that are based on these really thick brushstrokes, in which he doesn't even attempt to hide them at all. And then Georges Seurat, who with his technique called pointillism, simply creates points of color. And if you look at it closely, it's all it looks like. But if you stand back, what you get is an image. One last intellectual and cultural movement that I want to talk about is the merger of Hegelian and Nietzschean philosophy, German philosophy, with the transformation of Darwin, because Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1854. It followed his voyage on the Beagle, right, in which he had observed these finches on the Galapagos Islands, whose beaks seemed to be just properly formed for the environment in which they lived. And Darwin concluded that species evolve in response to the demands of their environment. Some individuals in a population are genetically well suited to thrive in that population. Some individuals in a population are not. And those who are not die off before they have a chance to reproduce and pass on their characteristics to another generation. Those who are well suited, they survive, they reproduce, they pass on their characteristics to the next generation, and gradually only those characteristics prevail, and the characteristics that are unfit, they disappear. Well, that philosophy was then taken and applied to human society by Herbert Spencer in his Principles of Biology. It was Herbert Spencer who actually coined the phrase survival of the fittest. Darwin did not. Herbert Spencer basically took that idea and applied it to human society and said, there are some humans who are well endowed to survive in this modern society, this industrial urban society, and there are others who are not. And he essentially argued that the best course of action was to let those who were unfit just die off. That, again, it fit very well with the sort of liberal approach, that laissez-faire approach, that it was not the government's job, or it was not any sort of private organization, churches, or anybody's job to try to save those who were ill-equipped to survive in the industrial urban society. That, in fact, by doing so, it actually condemned humanity to progress more slowly. the best thing would be for these people who were ill-equipped to survive to die off naturally so that they couldn't pass on their inferiority to the next generation. This became known as social Darwinism. And the interesting thing about that was that concept really fit well with a lot of the philosophy that was coming out of Germany and had been since the beginning of the 19th century. You have a German philosopher named George Friedrich William Hegel. And Hegel, he had proposed that the pursuit of truth takes the form of what's called a dialectic. That is essentially a dialogue between thesis and antithesis. So the pursuit of truth begins with thesis and antithesis, two opposing views. They clash, that is to say they compete, and either one of them completely triumphs over the other, but more likely the best of each is taken and you get what's called synthesis. And the synthesis is a little closer to truth than either antithesis or thesis that you began with. And the synthesis becomes the new thesis until a new antithesis comes along, and this process continues. And as it continues, you get closer and closer to the truth. But it only happens as a result of competition. And this competition forces out the weaker ideas and allows only the stronger ideas to pass forward. And many people, hearing Darwin's theory and then hearing Herbert Spencer apply it to human society, were delighted because it seemed like everything was coming together and you were beginning to get a sense that there was a universal explanation for all progress. You had a group of people known as the Young Hegelians. These were followers of Hegel who were especially delighted by this. It seemed as though one principle governed all progress, and it was the principle of competition. Competition was what drove ideas forward toward perfection. Competition was what weeded out, competition for scarce resources is what weeded out the weaker individuals of a population and killed them off before they could reproduce and allowed only the good traits to be passed on to the next generation. So it seemed as though competition was the driving force behind human progress. This came to be known as monism, this idea that nature and humanity all followed the same rule set, that nature and humanity were all driven forward in their progress toward perfection by one engine, in this case competition. It became known as monism. So everything is one, monism. And it was a sort of a disturbing thing, this idea that some would have to die off in order that humanity as a whole could progress forward. It was challenged, critiqued by charitable people, Christian people, who argued that all individual human life was sacred and ought to be cherished, and that it was the requirement of each individual to look out for others. But that idea was in turn challenged by another German, Friedrich Nietzsche, Nitzsche, Nietzsche, in his The Will to Power, in which he essentially said that the Judeo-Christian system of ethics, which held that it was the responsibility of all to look after all, to love your neighbor, to care for your neighbor, and to act charitably toward those who were weak, he essentially said that was nothing but that whole philosophy was pernicious, was bad. It was created by the weak to justify being weak, to justify calling on the powerful not to run over them in their progress toward perfection, but rather to hold all of society back for their sake. And he essentially said, we have to dispel this. We must be rid of this. If human society is to progress to its finest, best state, we have to reject the Judeo-Christian ethic that says we must look after everyone and look after the weak. All of this then sort of came into a conclusion, into a culmination during the era of imperialism, because the next step was to apply this philosophy to whole human societies. So, apply it to individuals, in nature, finches and so on, apply it to individuals in human society, apply it to societies. So some societies were strong, some societies were weak. And the idea that the strong ones would then conquer the weak ones came to be seen as just the natural order of things. Just as sure as strong organisms would survive and weak ones wouldn't, strong civilizations, strong countries would conquer. And it became a basis for justifying imperialism. In the end, you have a work in 1895 by Ernst Haeckel, again a German, called Welträtsel, Riddle of the Universe, in which he essentially says this: the German state has one purpose and one purpose only. The great competition between countries is coming. In fact, it has already started. And the purpose of the German state is to gear up the German nation, the people, the Volk, for this competition so that Germany will win. And it will mean that individuals will have to concede a lot of their interests and a lot of what they want to the good of the state. And so this idea that the power of the German state derived from its people, and that the state now had to organize the people for this competition, really is leading us into World War I and ultimately World War II. It helps us to understand not only imperialism, but really a lot of the violence of the 20th century. So we're going to stop there, and it's a long one. It's a long review session, but hopefully a valuable one.